So years ago, and by years ago I mean 2019, I was in Rome, and I was in a bus, and I was heading towards a particular suburb of Rome, and I sat next to this woman, and the reason why I sat next to her was because the bus was so damn crowded, which is so typical of Roman buses, that you had to sit next to someone. In fact, in Rome, you are lucky if you can find someone to sit next to because the seats are so crowded. And it's not just the bus system, by the way, it's also the McDonald's. I have never seen a McDonald's more packed than when I was in Rome. Literally, I am sitting next to strangers. I was sharing a table with strangers at McDonald's in Rome. Anyway, so I'm sitting next to this lady, and I'm looking at her because she was a very good-looking lady, I must say, and I noticed that she didn't look Italian. Italian people have a certain face. Italian men, they usually look like they're very depressed, that they're, about to go to some job that they don't want to be in. They look like they miss their grandmother's cooking. They have that sort of face. All Italian women, when they reach a certain age, well, not all, but Italian women generally, when they reach a certain age, they tend to look like they want a divorce. They look very, very depressed and miserable and all that. And it's like, I think it's when they hit their 30s, they kind of hit that wall of misery, and they have that look, like the eyes are droopy, the nose looks like it's an eagle's beak. They look sad. A lot of them do, I must say. But this woman, she didn't look Italian. She didn't have the look, okay? She didn't have the look, and I was like, this woman's not Italian. So I said, where are you from? And she said, oh, I'm from France. And I said, oh, fascinating. Which part of France? And she said she was from some suburb outside of Paris. And we start talking about French history, et cetera, and I said, what's your opinion on the French Revolution? And she said, I think that the French Revolution was evil. I was perplexed by this answer. I was a little bit shocked by this answer because for so long I have heard that the French people idolize their revolution. And for the most part, this is true. They revere it, they mythologize it, they make it a part of their pantheon, their governmental pantheon. It's part of their state religion. They got rid of Catholicism, so they had to replace it with something else. They replaced it with nationalism. So anyway, she says, I think the French Revolution was evil. And I said, that's amazing. I said, well, why do you say that? And she says, because I am a Vendee. Really? She says, I am part of the French people group known as the Vendee, the French demographic known as the Vendee. Now, the people of the Vendee, they were very, very poor. I think the Vendee was probably the poorest area of France. The people of the Vendee were also very religious. So they were peasants, they were poor, they worked the fields all day, but at the same time, they were very pious people. They prayed every day. They sang the chants. They were very devoted to the church. They were very loyal to the church, and they were also very loyal to the king. So they were loyalists, and at the same time, though, they had this very simple, rustic, but at the same time, very sublime and profound faith. And it was a faith that was impenetrable. It was, it really surpassed the governmental pressure that was being imposed upon them by the revolutionary state that took over the monarchy in France. And she said that she believed that the French Revolution was evil. And why would someone who was of this particular demographic have this opinion? It's because the French Revolution, when it really unleashed its reign of terror, butchered the people of the Vendee. It butchered the people of the Vendee because the people of the Vendee refused to reject their church. They refused to comply with the government, in its persecution of the priests and its persecution of the Catholic faith, and it also resisted its enforced draft. So when the French Revolution was taking place, other countries in Europe were very, very worried about what was taking place because they were concerned that the hysteria of the revolution could, like a plague, spread into their countries. The English had this fear, the Spanish had this fear, the Austrians had this fear. So the other European countries decided to go to war against France. This is really for the reason that Napoleon rose, because they needed a strong military leader to fight against the other European countries that wanted to war against France. So the Austrians and the Prussians began to head towards France to invade the country and bring some sort of stability. The revolutionary government, which is commonly known as the Assembly, they enforced a draft. So they basically said, okay, the peasants, the poor, the unemployed, they all need to join the military so we can fight off France's foreign enemies. Now, the Vendée resisted the draft. I keep calling them the Vendée. I'm thinking in Spanish. The Vendee. The Vendee resisted the draft. And you have to, because people could assume and say, well, they were a bunch of cowards and they were not patriotic, et cetera, et cetera. You have to put yourself in their shoes. You have to put yourself in their perspective. Their perspective was, you've murdered our priests. You've completely and utterly disrespected our religion. You murdered our king. Why would I consider the Austrian or the Prussian an enemy of mine? I mean, it's like, who needs enemies when we have friends like you? And that saying really fits this situation. So the Vendee resisted the draft. They're like, we're not going to fight your stupid wars. And so the Vendee decided to take up arms and fight against the revolutionary government. They fought against the Assembly. And believe it or not, the Vendee, they were very poor. They were very underarmed. They didn't have the military weapons that the revolutionary government had. But at the same time, they had one thing, and that is faith. And with faith comes willpower, valor, and determination. I'm not a fan of Che Guevara, but Che Guevara said that the one thing that is needed for victory, the one thing, the very necessary ingredient for a military victory is will and determination. Without these things, you can't really win a war. And the French people, the Vendee specifically, they had this determination. I want to read to you guys a quote from the historian Christopher Dawson. Christopher Dawson was a very reputable historian back in his day, and by back in his day, I mean the first half of the 20th century. And he wrote a book. It's called The Gods of Revolution. I'm currently reading it. I'm almost done with it. It's actually a very good book. I've really been enjoying the read. And I want to read to you guys an excerpt from this book in which he describes the faith of the Vendee. So he says here, "It was a war of the people against the government, of the village against the town, and of the peasants against the bourgeoisie. The insurgents were, for the most part, simple farmers or laborers, without arms or military experience. When the church bells sounded the alarm, they would take their rosary and their guns, or pitchforks, and march on the enemy, chanting the Vixilla Regis, and when the battle was over, they would return to their fields." And an officer who reported on the situation to the Jacobin Club at Paris asked, quote, "What is the good of tactics against men who fight with a rosary and a scapular in their hands and throw themselves on our artillery armed with nothing but sticks?" And he concluded that as the wretches were insensible to the language of reason, the only course was to kill them all, or they will kill us. So this was the state of France at the time, and the French rebels, the revolutionaries, they decided to murder all of the Vendee. And so there was a policy of genocide against these people. Hundreds of thousands of people were butchered. I want to say around 250,000 people in the Vendee were slaughtered. People were stripped naked. Men and women were tied together, completely naked with ropes, and they were forced into ships, and the ships would be sunk, and the people would drown in the ships. There were people who were beheaded. There were people who were trampled under horses. Not even children were spared. It was a complete and utter genocide. It was a Holocaust. It was a Holocaust. It was really the Holocaust of 18th century Europe. It was a genocide. There are, in fact, people in France who want the Vendee massacre to be considered a genocide. And I think that is actually appropriate because the French, the Enlightenment, Freemasonic French rebels really did pursue the extermination of these people. And it really fits the definition of genocide, because what is genocide? Genocide is the attempt at exterminating a people, be it for their race or for their religion. When you kill people with the purpose of exterminating them, that is genocide. So when you say, well, I want to exterminate all the Turks or the Armenians or whoever, Turk, Armenian, Greek, that is genocidal. Or when you say, I want to exterminate all the Jews, I want to exterminate all the Arabs, that's genocidal. If you say, I want to kill all the Christians, that's genocidal. And there are a lot of people who want to do that. So what happened in France was genocide. But look at the faith of these people. These were people who were peasants, they were farmers, they weren't really educated, but at the same time, they had this enormous sublime faith. And that's one thing I've realized a lot talking to different people. You meet people who are very educated, they read the books, they read Latin or Greek or whatever. They can tell you about Socrates, or they can tell you about, what Plato told some Italian guy, 5,000 years ago. And they can say, yeah, I'm Catholic and I'm a Christian scholar or whatever. And they're very educated, but at the same time, a lot of these people are just... they're just prisoners within their own intellectual ivory towers, and they're constantly trying to gain the acceptance of the intellectual of their intellectual constituencies or their peers or their academic superiors. Whereas when you look at people who are not necessarily educated but they have faith, when those people have faith, that faith is like a fire, and they're filled with zeal. And you see this, for example, you can see this sort of thing in Mexico. I remember reading stories about the autodefensas and these young Catholic peasant people in Mexico. And I'm not talking about the 1800s. I'm talking about 2010, 2011, 2014, 2015. And you read these stories about these farmers in Mexico who were fighting the narcos because the narcos were exploiting them. They were raping their children. They were stealing their kids. They were murdering random people for human sacrifices, and these farmers in Mexico, specifically in the state of Michoacan, rose up and fought against the narcos and actually would defeat the narcos. And these were narcos who had the guns, and they had the Hummers, and they had the AK-47s and the machine guns, and you had these peasants in Mexico with .22 caliber rifles. And they were taking these narcos out. And you actually read similar things in regards to the Vendee. The Vendee would fight the French military. They were fighting the revolutionary military, which had all the weapons of the old regime. And the Vendee were slaughtering the revolutionary military. Even though the revolutionary forces, the government of the French Assembly or whatever, even though they had the better weaponry and they probably had the better tactics, the peasants would defeat them in battle. They would defeat them in the battlefield because they had faith. Bottom line, they had faith. And I want to show you guys a little bit of something here. I want to show you guys really how evil the French Revolution was. It truly was evil. It was satanic, and it was Masonic. I used to laugh when I used to hear conspiracy theories about the Freemasons. Like people say, "Oh, Freemasons, they're evil. We have to, watch out for them. We have to be wary of the Masonic Lodge and the history of it." And I used to laugh at that. And then I actually started looking into the history, and I'm like, "Oh my goodness, the whole French Revolution was done by the Masons. The Mexican Revolution was done by the Masons. The Catholic Church warns about the Masons more so than any other cult in all of the Catholic Church's history of warning people about cults." And so it's something definitely to consider. I mean, you read about the narco organization in Mexico, the what do they call them? Caballeros Templarios. They literally call themselves the Knights Templar. There was a paramilitary group in Germany that was founded by a Mason, and they would do Masonic rituals. Like, these things still exist, and they were trying to do a revolution in Germany. These things still happen. They still exist. These groups still exist. So anyway, in the French Revolution, there was a guy by the name of Bertrand Berere. Now listen, you're going to say, Ted, it's not Berere. It's Bereri. Okay, I'm not French. I tried to look up how to pronounce this guy's name. I couldn't find anything, so I'm just going to go with my Spanish pronunciation, okay? Berere. So there was a guy by the name of Bertrand Berere, Freemason, and he believed in a religion of the fatherland. And in fact, he believed that the French language was the language of the revolution. It was the language of equality. It was the language of freedom. And at the same time, he wanted to protect France from minority populations in France. And by minority population, these were most likely other European groups living at the time in the country. But it was racism. It was tribalism, and Bertrand Berere, he believed in a religion of the fatherland. In fact, he believed that the Catholic Church should be replaced by a religion of nationalism, and in so doing that, every French person, when they are born, should be consecrated to the religion of the fatherland. So instead of the baby being baptized, the baby would be consecrated to the state. So all this stuff about, the Catholic Church is tyrannical and evil. Well, when you get rid of the Catholic Church, guess what? Another religion is going to replace it. And it's going to be tyrannical and destructive. And most people aren't going to like it. But this guy, he had a religion of the fatherland. Now, I have to use this to warn conservatives, because conservatives many times will say, well, the French Revolution was liberal. It was of the left. And in a way, they're correct. Like, they're not wrong, because the people who were against the king were considered at that time leftists. The terminology of right wing and left wing, all of that goes back to France. The people who supported the king were considered right. The people who were against the king were considered left. You get the point. But the term left wing and right wing have changed over the centuries, and now we have different ways of thinking in regards to those terms. So like you could be right wing and not necessarily be a monarchist. You can be left wing and not necessarily against monarchy, or not necessarily a Republican, because the people of the left in those days wanted a republic. They were Republican. They considered themselves Republican, just like the Mexican revolutionaries also considered themselves Republicanos, Republican. In America, right-wingers call themselves Republicans. So the term has changed over the centuries. But nonetheless, conservatives today, conservative intellectuals and people who are very interested in history and all that, they will talk about the French Revolution, and they will say, well, look, it was done by liberals. It was done by the left. And it's like, yes, you're correct. But here is the warning that I have for you guys. Because a lot of you guys mean well, but I have to issue a warning. You can expose the French Revolution and say, look at what the leftists of the past did, and look at what leftism brought to France. But at the same time, don't start praising right-wing groups and organizations, especially if they're European, because the European ones tend to be a little bit Nazistic. And American ones can do that as well. But European ones, they have this very strong tendency. And you can have people who are conservatives, and they'll say, well, look at these amazing patriots in Europe, or look at these amazing nationalists in Europe. And what you guys don't understand, what these conservatives don't understand, is that those nationalistic ideas were in the French Revolution. And it's not a contradiction, because you say, well, they were leftists, how could they be nationalists? Because for one thing, the terms have changed. Secondly, what I will also say is that strong nationalism was also something that was upheld by progressives in the first half of the 20th century. people who considered themselves progressive also upheld to racism. They also upheld Darwinism and strong nationalistic beliefs and eugenics. H.G. Wells considered himself a progressive, and he believed that the English language was the superior language of the world, and everyone on earth should speak English. I guess you could say that's not nationalism. You could argue that's universalism, but nonetheless, there is most definitely a sentiment of Anglo superiority in that idea. So another guy of the French Revolution that I want to introduce you guys to is Jacques-René Hébert. And Hébert, he actually wanted to destroy all of Christianity in France. Because when the French Revolution first began, the rebels said, okay, you can be Catholic, you can be Christian, but you have to adhere to the state-accepted or the state-recognized church. So there was a state-recognized Catholic church, and then there was the authentic Catholic church that was rejected by the French. The state program, the state church, called itself Catholic, but it really wasn't. And it was really just a front to give the idea to Catholics that, hey, the government accepts us, and we should just accept the agendas of the state. It was deceptive. Most of the cardinals in France rejected the state-accepted church. Most Catholics in France rejected the state-recognized church and wanted nothing to do with it. Hébert wanted to completely get rid of the state-sanctioned church. In fact, I think it was eventually dissolved within the time of the revolution, and the cardinal who was set up as the head of this church actually renounced his position. He didn't really have any faith to begin with. So Hébert, he said, forget the state Catholic Church, forget the other Catholic Church, just get rid of the whole thing, destroy all of Christianity. And he wanted to do a policy of De-Christianization. And this is something that was actually done in France, which is why, for example, the Cathedral of Notre Dame was made into the Temple of Reason. It's so crazy because the French Revolution is something that today a lot of atheists I think all atheists will revere the French Revolution. And atheists will talk about why religion is just for superstition. It's just nonsense, garbage. But then they'll talk about the glories of the French Revolution. And what they don't want to admit, or maybe they don't realize this, is that human beings are designed for religion. And I've made this argument numerous times. You can go back thousands upon thousands of years. Humans had religion. You can read about, for example, when the Gauls invaded Rome. There was a Roman man who was getting his family out of the city, and he saw some Vestal virgins. These were women who kept their virginity and just dedicated their lives to the temple, to the sacred fire of the gods. And this Roman man saw these Vestal virgins by themselves, and he said, he got his family off the wagon and said, get on the wagon and get out. And he sacrificed himself. He sacrificed his own family. He put his family's life on the line in the middle of an invasion of his city, just to protect these pagan nuns. I mean, these were the nuns of the pagan world, these pagan virgins, and these celibates of the gods. And it's like, well, I'm not a pagan, and I definitely don't support paganism, but nonetheless, that was an act of devotion and religion. So, and these people weren't stupid. They were very educated people. You can't tell me the people of the Roman Empire were uneducated. They were very educated people. A lot of our philosophy, a lot of our Western philosophy, a lot of our system of government in the Western world is rooted in Roman ideas. And these people were all religious. And religion is just a part of who we are as a society. So the French got rid of the Catholic Church, and they said, okay, this Cathedral of Notre Dame, replace it with what? The Temple of Reason. There was also another guy, his name was Joseph Fouché. He was also a Freemason. And he wanted to slaughter all of the Christians in France and to express his utter contempt for the Christian religion. He actually took a donkey, dressed the donkey up as a priest, and had the donkey drag a copy of the Gospels and a Roman missal. And this was a way to completely and utterly mock religion. And that's another thing. The mockery of religion is always in the atmosphere of anti-Christianity and really anti-religion in general. People who want to commit, when you're in a very tense political atmosphere where people actually want to kill and murder religious people, you will know that there is mockery also in that society. One example that I remember is in 4th century Egypt, when the Arians had taken over much of Egypt. As Saint Jerome tells us, the great majority of people in the Roman Empire had become Arian. The Arians, by the way, were heretics who rejected the divinity of Christ. They rejected the Holy Trinity. They were anti-Christ heretics. The people in 4th century Egypt, when there was so much heresy, they had a lot of mockery against the church. And I remember reading from an ancient Christian history book. I think it was written by Isocrates, or was it? I'm not sure if it was written by Isocrates or some other church historian. But nonetheless, the book says that at the time when Arianism was very popular, there were comedians on stages who were making mockeries of Christ. So when you have mockery, mockery is really a form of, it's a political statement that is cloaked as humor. The reason for this, the reason why they do it in a humorous way, is twofold. One, it's really a form of mass manipulation. One, it is to get people to accept something by laughing. One of the ideas that popped up in the Enlightenment was that if you laugh at something, that is your mind naturally rejecting it. So people in the Enlightenment would present Christian ideas and present it in a very mocking way. People would laugh. Ah, you laughed. The fact that you laughed, well, that was out of your control. So therefore, your mind naturally is repulsed by Christianity. So naturally, your body, your mind does not accept Christianity. Therefore, it is against the Enlightenment, it's against logic, and should be rejected. So by making something into a joke, it makes it easier to reject that something because it's just a joke and you're laughing, and it makes the rejection of that thing that is mocked very convenient. Secondly, when the people complain about the mockery, the mockers can simply reply by saying, it's just a joke. Why are you making a big deal about it? So this is a form of mass manipulation, and it's very effective. It's very effective, and you see this all the time in the comedy industry. Another thing also is there was another guy in the French Revolution. His name was Louis Saint-Just, and he was extremely anti-Christian, wanted to kill the Christians. In fact, he was very much so responsible for the purging of Robespierre's political enemies. You know, the Girondists. He was responsible for the mass killing of the what were they called? The Dantaists or something. I don't remember what they were called, but they were the people who were competing against Robespierre. He killed the moderates, those people. So Louis Saint-Just said, quote, "The Republic will never be established until the will of the sovereign people represses the monarchist minority and reigns by the right of conquest. You have to punish whoever is passive in the Republic and does nothing for it. Those who cannot be ruled by justice must be ruled by the sword." Sounds like Islam. It sounds like when Joseph Smith said, "Those who do not follow Joseph Smith will get the sword." And yes, he did say this. He said, in the future it shall be Joseph Smith or the sword, just as in the time of Muhammad it was Al-Quran or the sword. Joseph Smith said this. You can look it up. So what we find here is basically what happens anytime you have a revolution. You have a revolution. The rebels become the elites, even though the rebels before were talking about the evils of the elites and the evils of the people and the powers that be. And then when they take power, what happens? Bam, they become the power holders, they become the elites, and they start killing people. And they become a lot worse than the people they claim to be against. We saw this in Ukraine with the what's it called? The Maidan revolution. We saw this in Syria with the Syrian revolution. We saw this in Libya. All the people who hated Gaddafi ended up being monsters. The world saw this in the French Revolution. This is why I do not trust rebels. You have people who come around and they're like, the elites are this, and the elites are that, and the elites are this, and it's like, really? Are you eating KFC? Are you stuffing your fat ass with fried chicken? Why are you complaining? What's the problem? Are you being sent to a camp? What is the reason for a revolution? What is the reason for a rebellion? And what we will eventually find out is that the people who, and I hope that more and more people realize this, the people who always complain about the elites are just people who want to be the elites. And I'm not saying that the government isn't worthy of criticism, or that technological elites should be completely trusted, because they shouldn't. But what I will say is that when people complain about the government, I'm not talking about private corporations, but when people complain about the government, they just want to be the government. And in fact, yeah, I will include the people who criticize private corporations, because not all of them are really trustworthy either. Because people who say, well, YouTube and Facebook, they're really, really bad. Well, yeah, they are bad. Don't get me wrong. They should be exposed, and they should be criticized. But at the same time, some of these people who criticize social media, they want to make their own social media, and they want to promote their own ideas, which can be destructive, and they want to eventually shut down the competition. So we have to be very wary of all of these things when we get into this. We can't automatically trust certain people. We shouldn't automatically think that certain people are heroes just because they're talking bad about the government, or they're talking bad about some technocrats or some elites. We should look at everything with a grain of salt, and we should also look at the evidence and weigh it out. Yeah, so those are my opinions. This is a 30-minute long video already, and I'm just going to stop talking. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.